Hey folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin, Eclectic Album Reviews and General Musical Meanderings. And I am bringing you my first album from 2020. It is Floating Points Crush. And one of the big draws for it was its cover art. I mean, the cover art for this is fantastic. It sort of makes a case for having a physical object, you know. The CD is beautiful. I almost want to buy it on vinyl. Just so I could hang the artwork on my wall. I mean, I could blow it up and it would look amazing hanging in my house just as a piece of art by itself. And it turns out that the album cover itself is a product of a bit of an experiment that Floating Points was engaging in with film and bubbles and piezo electronics hooked up to drums and stuff. It's the artistic result of scientific experimentation, and as such, it represents its intended album extremely well. Floating Points Crush is a dazzling display of extremely uncontrived, but very deeply engaging electronic music. First time I listened to it, I could sense its depth. I could sense that there's something going on with it, and as I was listening to it, it felt very fulfilling to listen to. It's like, I should be listening to this. This feels very important. And because of that, I was really excited to listen to it, so much so that whenever I took my kids to see Frozen 2 for the third time, I snuck my earbuds in along with me, and the first 45 minutes of the movie for that particular showing was actually Crush. And it was nothing quite that psychedelic, don't get me wrong. But there's a little bit of experimentation that went into that video. I think that also goes along with, again, the aesthetic of Crush. Because this sense of experimentation permeates the album in a way that I find really, really appealing. And I think is also a characteristic of the Floating Points as a project. The project itself is centers around a gentleman named Sam Shepard. And Sam Shepard's kind of a polymath, genius sort of guy. He got his start as a classically trained piano player and then sort of chafed, I guess, under the rules of classical piano, then started moving into jazz piano and became a somewhat serious jazz piano player playing live gigs and doing that sort of thing. As he's becoming a jazz pianist, he also starts to DJ on the side. So not only is he playing jazz, but he's also delving into the history of vinyl and doing a pretty good job of making a name for himself as a DJ. And that job that he has as a DJ, he continued as he went into his neuroscience PhD, which he completed. So in short, the guy's pretty much a pretty bright guy and definitely an intellectual in his own way. This is my first experience with Floating Points. He had made several EPs and also had a debut album called Elena. And Elena, which I haven't heard yet, but I've got a really big pin put in that one right now because as much as I love this album, that album has gotten almost universal critical acclaim. So that's going to be one that I look at probably a little bit later. But the interesting thing that I want to note about that is that album featured quite a few live musicians. It's identified as kind of a dance electronic album, but also had this sort of, still has some vestiges, I think, of Sam Shepard's jazz background on it because he used a lot of live musicians on the album. The Crush album doesn't really have live musicians aside from Sam Shepard. He sort of shed that whole thing. But despite that, still has this really spontaneous and organic feel to it. And that's partially because of the way he generated the album. Floating Points was invited to go out on tour and do some opening tour dates for the XX, which is kind of a high-profile gig. And in order to kind of push himself out of his comfort zone, Sam Shepard had acquired a Buchla Synthesizer. The Buchla Synthesizer is kind of an unwieldy, quirky instrument. And in order to understand how it worked, instead of like sitting down somewhere in a closet or a shed somewhere to try to figure out how to make the thing work, he just went out on stage every night and improvised live things on the Buchla in front of the XX's audience. Bold move. And he would do this every night, not really knowing exactly what was going to happen, just kind of making stuff up on the Buchla and running with it. So all of this work that he did, all of this sort of live improvisation, forged the basis for what would end up being on Crush. So that sense of spontaneity that comes with the album comes because many of much of the material that forms the basis of this album was initially improvised. Now, along with using the Buchla as the foundation for a lot of the music on this album, Sam Shepard also collected a small array of other idiosyncratic synthesizers and drum machines. Nothing too shiny and nothing too digital. A lot of them are kind of older synthesizers that are very quirky. One of them, I believe, is called the Rhodes Chroma, which is notoriously difficult to perform, so much so that he actually hired somebody to create an app so that he could program it more easily. And then a Yamaha CS70 was another one, a synthesizer he used quite a bit in the album. What it seems like to me is that Sam Shepard goes and sets up the Buchla and syncs it up with a drum machine and maybe another keyboard sequencer, and then kind of improvises kind of jazz style stuff over these textures, almost like he's creating a rhythm section with one set of synthesizers and he's improvising like a jazz pianist with another set of synthesizers. None of those, however, have a very distinctive jazz sound. So the sort of underpinnings of improvisation and jazz that are on the album are kind of masked behind the sounds of very classic analog synthesizers. And even as you hear him doing these improvisations on the album, you can hear him mutating the rhythm section and the more kind of legit work, and also kind of glitching it up so it never really sounds too live, but also never allowing it to go into full repetition, kind of push and play mode. And because he uses this variety of synthesizers in different combinations, quite a bit of variety shows up on the album. The album seems to be centered on 5 or 6 brainy raver banger tracks. You know, they're high energy, could be dance music, but are also really not really, I don't think, necessarily intended to be dance music. It's very heady stuff if you're listening to it, but it's got the BPM, it's at the right pace. To where it could also work on the dance floor or something like that. And unlike a lot of other artists in the genre, he doesn't just let the automation run with it. Anytime it starts to feel a little bit static, he'll tweak a beat, he'll glitch it out, he'll play something really compelling, some kind of compelling jazz chord. He's always playing back and forth with these things, so it always has that sense of being improvised as it evolves. Now, alongside these kind of high energy tracks, there's these quieter, kind of almost 20th century feeling compositions that go along inside between them. It's tempting to look at these things as kind of interludes between the bigger tracks, but actually there's a lot of meat and potatoes that happens in these quieter tracks. I mean, if you have any doubt in your mind as to how much thought Sam Shepard put into these, in the liner notes, he lays it very clearly to rest because you open it up and there's sort of a lead sheet for one of the pieces on the album. Birth is the name of the song. It's almost like a legit piano piece. He's playing it on this very thin-sounding, ethereal keyboard that would normally be associated with almost a new age sound. But it's way too deep a piece of music to really warrant that label. Now, just to put some finishing touches on this, many of the tracks also do have some live musicians on that he brought in to kind of flesh out some of the pieces. But he leans very strongly towards more classical instrumentation on those songs, where he appends the group that way. The opening track is a great example where he has this part that's very, very 20th century. It's got violins and flutes and trumpets on it that give it this very orchestral scope that also he glitches out, that he plays within the studio and cuts up a little bit so it doesn't sound too much like any one thing. It still has that sense of being a very 21st century electronic album, but again has that very organic feeling to it. Very effective use of crossing the different kinds of instrumentation to get the most out of those particular instruments' affordances. Shepard's intellect really shines brightly on Crush, but not in a way that seems really aloof or a distant. In fact, it's very engaged, it seems like to me. Intellect can be generated from a variety of different ways. You know, a person can choose to conquer knowledge, usually not always, but usually to make up for insecurity. You know, and that's why you have people who conquer their insecurity by becoming more and more intellectual, you know. But on the other hand, there are people who become intellectuals because of an insatiable sense of curiosity, a desire to explore. And that curiosity is what permeates, to me, this Crush album. I mean, you listen to interviews with Sam Shepard, you watch him talk about the album, and he's always playing with these things and thinking like, I haven't figured this out yet, but I think you could do this. As you can see, he's always just trying to figure out how to make the next thing work for him in a way that's expressive. So I see Floating Points Crush not just as sort of a finished product, a result of Sam Shepard's bring his intellect to bear on a musical product, but I see it as a document of his process. I can't suggest Floating Points highly enough. It's a great disc that captured my attention very early on, and I keep coming back to it. It's one that I think that has enough depth that it could be a real classic in the long run. So highly suggested. Please check it out if you have the opportunity. And if you have the opportunity and you like this video, you should like it. You should subscribe to it. You can share it with your buddies. You can also go find me over on Spotify. I'm putting tracks up of stuff that I've been listening to this year. So, and if you have music that you're listening to and that you'd like to share with me, I would definitely appreciate that. That's where this kind of interaction breeds that sort of knowledge and dialogue. So that's the point of the whole thing. So next week, I'm going to bring you another album. And until then, catch you on the flip side.